Good soil is the foundation of any successful garden, but buying fertilizer can get expensive fast, and not everyone has the space to store lots of fertilizer. Even if someone has plenty of land, poor soil can make it difficult to grow enough food to be self-sufficient. One of the easiest and most reliable ways to do this is with vermicomposting, a composting method that uses worms to turn food scraps into a powerful homemade soil amendment. Unlike traditional composting, which requires large piles, regular turning, and careful balancing of materials, vermicomposting takes up little space and requires almost no effort. This makes it perfect for people who want a low-maintenance, really nearly free way to improve their garden soil, even if they're older, they have limited mobility, or they don't want to deal with heavy lifting. A small worm bin can produce a steady supply of rich compost all year long, keeping your plants healthier and increasing yields without needing to haul in outside materials. So I'll take you through everything needed to set up and maintain a worm composting system, from choosing the right worms to using the finished compost. So what is vermicomposting? Vermicomposting is the process of using worms to break down food scraps and turn them into nutrient-dense worm castings. These castings are one of the best natural fertilizers available, and they help build soil that retains moisture, resists pests, and produces healthier crops. For anyone who is prepping for any long-term self-sufficiency, vermicomposting is a low-effort way to keep gardens productive without relying on outside fertilizers. Since the worms do all the work, there's no need for turning heavy compost piles, and it's easy to keep a worm bin going even in the winter. The system can be set up in a garage, a shed, a basement, or even indoors, making it possible to produce compost no matter what the weather is. Choosing the right worms. Not all worms are created equal when it comes to composting. The best worms for the job are called red wigglers, also known as Alcinia fetida. These worms are small but extremely efficient at breaking down organic material. They thrive in food scraps and bedding rather than soil, which makes them perfect for a worm bin. Garden earthworms, on the other hand, are not suitable for vermicomposting. They burrow deep into the ground and will not survive in a compost bin. Red wigglers are easy to find online or at local worm farms, and once a bin is started, they'll reproduce on their own. A small batch of worms can turn into a large population over time, providing a steady supply of compost with little effort. 1 single pound of red wigglers, which is about 1,000 worms, can eat and process up to half a pound of food scraps per day. Since red wigglers reproduce quickly, their numbers will double every 60 to 90 days. That means that within 1 year, a fully matured bin with 4 to 6 pounds of worms can process over 2,000 pounds or 1 ton of food scraps per year, producing 1,000 pounds of compost annually. And what's cool is they self-regulate their population based on the environment, so you really don't need to worry about them outgrowing their bins. Setting up a worm bin. To start vermicomposting, the first step is to build or find a worm bin or buy one. A plastic tote or a wooden box works well as long as it has good airflow. The bin should have small holes for ventilation, and it should be shallow rather than deep because red wigglers prefer to stay near the surface. A small 10-gallon bin is enough to get started with 1,000 worms, but for those who want higher compost production, a 20-gallon bin can sustain a thriving worm colony for years. If the goal is to create a serious amount of compost, a larger 24 to 30-gallon setup can handle several pounds of worms, turning nearly a ton of food waste into over 1,000 pounds of compost per year, all without taking up much space. Once the bin is ready, the next step is to prepare the bedding. Worms need a soft, absorbent material to live in. The best options include shredded newspaper, coconut coir, or peat moss. A handful of soil can be added to help the worms digest food more easily. The bedding should be damp, but never dripping wet. If squeezed, it should feel like a wrung-out sponge. After setting up the bedding, the worms can be added. They will burrow into the material and begin adjusting to their new home. Feeding the worms. Worms eat many common kitchen scraps, including fruit and vegetable peels, coffee grounds, tea bags, crushed eggshells, and small amounts of bread or grains. These materials break down quickly and provide nutrients that improve soil quality. On average, food scraps take about 2 to 4 weeks to fully transform into finished vermicompost. Some foods should be avoided because they can cause bad odors or attract pests. Meat, dairy, and oily foods are not good for a worm bin. Citrus peels, onions, and garlic should also be limited as they can make the bin too acidic. Worms do best when they're fed small amounts at a time. If food is disappearing quickly, more can be added. If scraps are piling up, it's best to slow down on feeding to prevent problems. Caring for the worm bin. A worm bin is super easy to maintain as long as a few simple conditions are met. The bedding should stay slightly damp, but not too wet. If it becomes too dry, a little water can be added. If it gets too soggy, more dry bedding can help absorb the excess moisture. Worms also need a steady temperature to stay healthy. They prefer conditions between 55 degrees and 77 degrees. If it gets too hot or too cold, they'll slow down or stop working altogether. Keeping the bin in the garage, shed, or basement can help regulate the temperature throughout the year. If the bin starts to smell bad, it's usually due to too much food, not enough air, or the wrong types of scraps being added. Adjusting the feeding schedule and stirring the bedding can help balance things out. Harvesting the compost. After a couple of months, the bottom of the bin will be full of dark, rich, crumbly compost. This is ready to be used in the garden. The easiest way to collect the compost without removing all the worms is to move fresh food to one side of the bin. The worms will migrate to that area, leaving finished compost behind, which can then be scooped out. Another method is to dump the bin onto a flat surface in bright light. Worms naturally burrow away from the light, making it easy to collect the compost from the top while the worms move downward. Using vermicompost in the garden. Worm compost is one of the best natural fertilizers available, and it can be used in multiple ways. It can be mixed into garden soil to improve plant growth. It can also be added to raised beds, used as a top dressing for potted plants, or soaked in water to make a liquid compost tea that can be sprayed onto plants for extra nutrition. A store-bought bottle of worm tea, which is the liquid fertilizer made from vermicompost, can cost anywhere from $15 for a small quart to over $50 for a single gallon, with premium brands charging even more. Since worm tea is easily made at home by steeping worm compost in water, a simple worm bin can provide an unlimited supply of this high-value fertilizer for free, saving hundreds of dollars per year. Troubleshooting common problems. Sometimes worms try to escape from the bin. This usually means the bedding is too dry, too wet, or it's lacking airflow. Adjusting the moisture level and making sure the bin has good ventilation solves this problem. If the bin starts to attract fruit flies or gnats, food scraps should be buried deeper under the bedding. Keeping the bin properly balanced will prevent most common issues. Vermicomposting is one of the easiest ways to create free, high-quality compost without relying on store-bought fertilizers. It requires almost no effort, takes up little space, and can be used year-round. Even for people with limited mobility, a worm bin can provide a steady supply of rich fertilizer with little work. In a long-term crisis where store-bought soil amendments might not be available, having an already established working compost system can make all the difference in maintaining a productive garden. For those who are serious about growing their own food and preparing for an uncertain future, vermicomposting is an easy, nearly foolproof method to build better soil and keep crops thriving year after year.